Unidentified flying objects have remained an item of controversy since they first appeared in the public zeitgeist in the late 1940s, and even today we remain intrigued with the idea, while many speculate as to whether or not they even exist. And more recently, we learned about the so-called Pentagon's UFO program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. But what do we really know about this enigmatic operation? And is there more that could be gleaned through things like Freedom of Information Act requests? Well, joining me today to talk about that is Alejandro Rojas of Open Minds TV. We're going to weigh in on this subject right now. Alejandro Rojas of Open Minds now joins us. Alejandro, how you doing?
I am well. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm enjoying some strong coffee, and I'm pondering some of the new information forthcoming over the last few days. And I got really excited because Stephen Aftergood, who does the secrecy newsletter for the Federation of American Scientists, he had posted online the other day a series of FOIA documents that were released to him that, to my knowledge, were the first time that I had seen in print on official documentation the actual mention of the Advanced Aviation Threat Identification Program, which isn't surprising per se, but nonetheless, it was kind of exciting for those of us who are both transparency advocates and also really interested in this project. So the first guy I contact is Alejandro Rojas. I'm texting Alejandro and saying, "Did you see this yet?" And Alejandro, of course, looks at it and says, "Oh, this is the same one that Nick Pope was given too." So as usual, you were all over this, and even before I was. And what it seems like happened was the same documentation had been requested back in maybe October or even earlier than that, and released at the same time to several researchers. And that brings us up to speed. Now, what exactly is the documentation that we're seeing on this in terms of some of the implications, who was asking about it, and what this release actually details?
Right. So what this release is a response to a request for products produced by the Advanced Aerospace Threat and Identification Program. The reason I emphasize "and" is, as we know, there's been a lot of alleged ideas of what the acronym AATIP represents, and the rule of thumb, Louise has been saying Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, so it's interesting to have that "and" in here on this document. But the point being that this was a response to that request for, what did they produce? And it's a list of documents. So George Knapp had released something somewhat similar to this in the past. And although his was shortened, then there was another one that came out, and I forget the origins of that one, that was more full. And this is kind of another version, just talking about all the types of documents that AATIP was working on. And it gives us the idea of the type of work they were working on. Now, all of these documents are kind of theoretical, future science types of things. And there was something interesting in here, too, another quote that, here it is. The purpose of AATIP was to investigate foreign advanced aerospace weapons threats from the present out to the next 40 years. So that is another important line. So a couple of things here. Okay, let's get into why that line's important. That line is important because Lou Elizondo has said that although funding was cut off for this sort of work in 2012, the program didn't end, and it continues to this day. He's told me personally that it is very high-level people that took over for him. But these are like, some big dogs.
Yeah, so I was going to interject. So he has unequivocally stated, at least as far as he can release information about this program to a civilian like you or I, he has said that it does continue and that this is something that remains operational.
The media, for the most part, accepts that. We've seen quite a few stories about AATIP. Recently, the Air Force Times wrote about it. And they wrote in their story, allegedly this program continues. Other outlets have kind of either skirted around this or done the same, said something like allegedly the program continues. So we don't have anything official that says this program still exists besides, Lou Elizondo's words, and he would know, especially if he's talking to people that are running the program. But some people doubt it. And at least this is a further confirmation that at least it was intended to continue to run, so it makes sense that it's still running. But then when you do get into the programs, we do see lots of future tech type of articles. So similar to what George Knapp had shown in the past, it's just that, they were collecting papers on potential technologies that adversaries or people may be using. I guess what this doesn't show, and what, I know some factions out there kind of contend, is that whether or not the UFO portion was actually a portion of this project. But, some of these papers are written by Hal Puthoff or Eric Davis with Earth Tech. These are guys who have worked in the past with Bigelow on paranormal topics. Puthoff is part of To the Stars Academy, started by Tom DeLonge, that Luis Elizondo is also part of, to look into the UFO phenomenon. And we know, at least from there, what they've told us is that what they're basing some of their work off of is their investigations into the paranormal and the UFOs. And of course, Luis has been very clear that that's been a big and primary thing for him, is to look into UFO cases. So it's, on the one hand, we don't have any products. We don't have any papers that were written about UFOs that are part of this list. But it does confirm that, one, the program existed, one, it may still be going on, and three, that they really were looking into, advanced weapon systems, and that this was something they had said in the past when this group was created. They couldn't just say it was about UFOs. They had to have it about something that is pertinent to the government, which is advanced weapon systems, and UFOs was something that kind of worked in that.
Yeah, absolutely. You and I have been looking at this for a long time. We've got a lot of colleagues in the field that have been doing the same thing. Paul Dean's one guy that comes to mind. There are plenty of others, and some outside of the UFO community, so to speak. Again, a good example of that is Stephen Aftergood. And as we see in the actual letterhead on the documents released to Nick Pope and Aftergood and a number of others over the last few days, it's made out to the Honorable John McCain. The late John McCain. Now, the reason for that,
right,
it's not so much to say that John McCain had a private interest in UFOs. This was, again, in the proper context. These were details, and Harry Reid's also addressed as well. This was to members of Congress, and it was detailing, as you put it, and as it's worded interestingly in the document, the products, basically in relation to this weapons systems, threat identification, and or as they term it, like you pointed out, and this is important, devil's in the details, threat and identification program contract. That's what they call it. That's just the kind of thing that Congress is going to be interested in, and they're going to want to look at. Now, I had a friend write to me over the weekend, and he said, from a historical perspective, the other thing we got to remember is the history of earmarks on part of the three congressmen who were involved in supplying or acquiring funding for this program. And so one way one might look at this is they were basically, they had a friend. We know that Harry Reid, of course, was friends with Bob Bigelow, and that there might have been some, political interests with regard to their constituency and their personal interests involved there. That doesn't, to me, diminish the importance of the fact that the program was underway. And the only other thing, and this is what I want to get your perspective on, Alejandro, a few people have said to me, to understand what this is, what little information is actually revealed in this document, apart from the name and the inclusion of "and" in that name, and then some of the science that they were looking at, people have kind of said you got to read between the lines to see what they're really talking about. And what's interesting is the kinds of studies that were outlined and the kinds of scientific areas of interest outlined in this list that was provided to Congress almost mirrors essentially what To the Stars Academy is doing right now. One of the authors of one of the papers, probably the most well-known, Hal Puthoff, now works for Tom DeLonge, as does Luis Elizondo. And it seems to indicate that what they're doing with the kind benefactor at the head there, Tom DeLonge providing some funding, etc., and the media face for all that, is they're kind of doing a civilian continuation of this advanced science applications study with interest in the possible applications as it relates to UFO. What are your thoughts?
No, I think that is completely fair, and I agree with that. In fact, in my lecture, when I do this, I kind of explain kind of the background, and then I show a map of the connections and how we have Bigelow, and Colm Kelleher, which is his lead scientist, who's also working with To the Stars. Hal Puthoff, which was another scientist who worked with Bigelow back into the 90s, investigating paranormal, who's also working with To the Stars. So I agree. I think that almost it could be argued that what we've seen is this evolution of Bigelow's, to begin with, the National Institute of Discovery Scientists to look into paranormal, an evolution of that group up into, and including these government agencies, which makes sense. And here's why, because this it's kind of the hidden history of all of this that George Knapp has revealed, but I don't think it's really taken root with everyone, which was that all of this began because of Bigelow investigations. So Bigelow, of course, did paranormal investigations. It turns out he was friendly with Harry Reid, and they had done some business together in the past, and turned out they both had an interest in the paranormal. So Harry Reid was keeping up to speed with what Bigelow was doing. Of course, he was a big player in Harry Reid's state that he represented. Well, Bigelow then looked into Skinwalker Ranch and purchased Skinwalker Ranch. And, George Knapp revealed that $22 million that the New York Times was talking about went to a program, AATIP, which was to investigate the Skinwalker Ranch. That began in 2007, pretty much when most of Bigelow's research was done. Then this program, AATIP, kind of came out of, and Bigelow was, of course, contracted to handle that, to handle the investigation of everything. So it really was all a continuation of Bigelow's work. And to this day, there's no doubt, and I don't think Elizondo would deny this, that there's been some influence on AATIP. And you can see that. Of course, you could see Hal Puthoff and Eric Davis, who are in these documents, who worked with Bigelow. So you see that it's kind of the same staff. But the premise all along, I think what we have to get back to is this idea that through the observation of paranormal phenomena, including UFOs, we can hopefully glean some technology that we can understand physics, we can understand how they're doing these things they're doing, and perhaps then obtain these abilities, understand these things so we can begin to use them in our weapon systems. Now, primarily, I think these scientists want to understand these technologies and develop them into, human technologies, not necessarily for weapons, but in order to get defense involved in defense dollars, it's got to be about weapons and defense.
Absolutely.
And so they've even talked about that, Reid and others, about how they had to gear it that way in order to get the funding to go forward. And you make a point about how important END is, and I think you have a good point there, because it says Advanced Aerospace Threat and Identification Program. And I think that at least is somewhat of a nod towards what Elizondo said they did, which is looking for UFOs, trying to identify, these potential advanced aerospace threats.
Yeah. And this kind of goes all the way back to something else I want to get into with you a little bit later, which has to do with Project Blue Book and a recent drama series that has to do with that. But to bring that into the conversation briefly as it relates to the AATIP program, a lot of people over the years, there's a lot of both politics and polemics, I think, that end up being involved in discussion of UFOs because the advocates, they, of course, and rightly so, I think, want to see serious study of something like this. And for my own part, and you and I talked about this when we were together in Wyoming back a few months ago, I have begun to look at the UFO phenomena, not just as a means of bringing a degree of credibility to it, but I think because this is both an important and perhaps even one of the central areas of interest to this subject, we kind of have to look at it in terms of national defense. Government does that. Anything that operates in our skies that seems to be capable of what this apparent technology can do in the better documented reports and the like, I mean, that should be of defense interest to our government. But the other side of it is, apart from identifying a threat, and to date there doesn't seem to be much literature that at any time has clearly indicated any threat potential, and government documentation from the past actually details this. It says we were never able to identify any kind of threat that seemed to be posed by these objects. And so this, in part, speaking historically, is one of the reasons why Project Blue Book ended. I mean, there was government it was taxpayer funding, of course, taxpayer money going into a government-sponsored project, under the U.S. Air Force that went on for close to 2 decades, I think from around 1952 to right around the beginning of 1969. By the end, of course, we know that the leadership at Project Blue Book, they were really downplaying these reports more so than they had early on, and that seemed to have been a trend throughout the Blue Book years. They were, over time, dismissing the reports more and more, and less because they thought that was the best way to represent the information they were gathering, but more because it seemed that they wanted to convey a narrative that there's nothing to study here. And then the so-called death nail in the coffin was the University of Colorado UFO project carried out by Edward U. Condon. The interesting thing about that, though, is that many UFO researchers feel like the subject was treated unfairly. And while that is true, if we were to look at it from the government side, it's very similar to what Harry Reid, Bob Bigelow, and others were attempting to try and do, it seems, with AATIP. They had to make it something that the government would be interested in. And for it to be of interest to government, there had to be the implication that there are weapons systems, technologies, and developments that we might be able to learn or develop as a result of study of this. And then, of course, there's also the threat identification part where we want to try and identify if there's something in our airspace that is a threat. That's the way you get government involved. And when those two elements aren't there, often, and I think, again, the historical precedent is shown with the end of Project Blue Book. If it's not there, they don't maintain that interest. Now, do you think that that's one of the big problems with studying UFOs, that while there appears to be a phenomena, that we can't get people in a practical way interested because they don't see a practical benefit from the study?
That's 100% right. I think you're absolutely correct. That first of all, we live in a world where you've got to make money. Any research or scientific research project out there has to have an end game that means profits. And it's rare that you get research in areas that don't have that. Sometimes government does need to step in for that reason. Corporations don't see that they can make a profit off of medicine. We've seen this even in cancer research, where they think, oh, well, we're not sure we can make money off of this medicine, even though it may help people. So government has to step in to fund that sort of research because it's got to make money. And so it's got to have a purpose. It's got to have a benefit. It can't be science for science sake, unfortunately, and that's frustrating for scientists. But then it gets into what you're saying. Then you have to play the politics game and begin to massage things and maneuver here. And I think you make a really good point. In that Project Blue Book, they said they were researching potential threats caused by UFOs, essentially, and they determined there was no threat posed by the phenomena, which is interesting in itself because it does seem that that's true. I mean, even with the Nimitz situation, they're chasing something around, but in none of the Blue Book cases does a threat seem to be posed. However, what Elizondo has done is something different, and I don't know if it's him or maybe Harry Reid in the group. This was what they were doing. But Elizondo is very quick to point out, and you've probably heard him say that, we all have in his interviews, that anything unidentified constitute a threat.
Potentially, yeah.
Potentially, but or at least from their perspective, they have to consider every unknown a threat.
Absolutely.
Until we know otherwise. And I think that ideology is important. Because Blue Book closed when they determined this unidentified whatever doesn't seem to pose a threat. Elizondo saying, no, if you're saying it's unidentified, then by its nature, it's still a threat from our perspective. So it's kind of justifying why we have to continue, even though Blue Book already happened. Blue Book determined, arguably, that there were unidentified craft identified. So what Lou is saying, that we can't stop there, that if they're unidentified, then we still need to consider them a threat. And that justifies us looking further into all of this. So there is a difference between the two programs in that manner. And this one is more actively looking to produce some science or some potential other benefits in developing weapons. From these identifications.
Absolutely. I think that makes perfect sense. And if we've learned anything new in what little has been released recently, as we're discussing here, and comparing AATIP to Project Blue Book, the clear case for why government studies this phenomena is made. We understand that there have to be applications that are practical to warrant government interest in this subject, but nonetheless, history shows they have certainly had that interest more than once. And one other question, I guess, that comes to mind for me, as we kind of shift our attention over to Project Blue Book, something that's been on a lot of people's minds lately due to a new history drama series, which is based on fact, but clearly takes some liberties with the facts itself. I think a lot of people are asking questions about, well, what did the U.S. Air Force really do during the 1950s and 60s as it relates to its UFO studies? And the question I have for you, Alejandro, is, was it just the U.S. Air Force? I remember APRO thinking that the CIA may have been the actual architects of the Blue Book program, whether or not that's really the case, because the CIA has published some documentation in terms of the history of the agency and its interest in the UFO subject. Gerald Haynes, I believe, the former chief historian for the CIA, wrote a really lengthy essay about the CIA's interest in UFOs, available at cia.gov. So I don't know that we can necessarily make the case that they were the so-called architects of Project Blue Book, as the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization insinuated back in the 60s and 70s under Jim and Coral Lorenzen. But there definitely is some historical data that could suggest that there were other agencies or other entities that were gathering some of the more, let's say, concerning cases from a national security standpoint. Again, is there evidence that there were other entities in government that were interested in UFOs? Specifically, let's talk about the Bollinger Memo. How does the Bollinger Memo play into that, and does it seem to indicate that that might have actually been the case?
Well, it does indicate that that they were sending the reports, the ones that they thought were more significant or had, I think the quote exactly is a potential, national security interest, were going somewhere else. So it did at least show that, the most important cases were being investigated. It said through its normal channels, and it even said in accordance with JNAP 146 or Air Force Manual 55-11. Which essentially was, you may have seen the famous poster where it's telling people, hey, if you see something like this, be sure to send these reports here. And it lists the different types of things that you're looking for. And, of course, it's enemy aircraft, unknown aircraft. And it says UFOs with a little image of like a Buck Rogers UFO. And these were instructions for the military. So we know that those reports were going elsewhere. So, and we have in on Open Minds YouTube video called, The Truth Behind Military UFO Secrecy, something like that, where we cover that it didn't stop there, that we know throughout the 70s and 80s, not so much in the 90s, it petered out as I guess maybe they got more secret, but documents showing that they were looking into various different UFO cases, but where did they go? You mentioned Paul Dean earlier, and he's done a great job of following that thread to try to figure out where these different reports went. And he's discovered a couple of different projects that were essentially kind of like AATIP. They were called, Advanced Physics Research Group, or not exactly that name, but similar names, indicating some sort of advanced type of science-based research group, and that these groups, their project names would change periodically. And I think Paul Dean even said he feels that it could be they changed their names just to keep their project or what they're doing secret.
Oh, yeah,
and so,
absolutely.
Yeah, so we have some indication that there was research going on, but we don't know very much about the details. And I think Paul Dean's a great person to bring up because he's been digging and probably gotten the closest to figuring out some of who these people were. Hopefully we'll have a history one day. But yes, that it does seem as though there was something else going on behind the scenes of Blue Book.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what that may have been, again, it may have been several somethings. And if we look at AATIP, again, rather than being a branch of government or being, some very well-defined and highly articulated organization. It may be that. I don't know. But again, if you notice in the recent document that was released, it's referred to as a contract. And what that seems to suggest to me is, there was some political maneuvering which allowed to acquire and then supply funding for some research. Bob Bigelow, again, on the civilian level, was doing a lot of that research. As we know, he was outsourcing to MUFON. But there was obviously government interest, both in the weapons systems applications and also in the threat aspect of all this. And that, again, it may not have been much more complex than that, although we did have also on the government side, Luis Elizondo and others, he has indicated, who were analyzing things and trying to make sense of what the so-called technology might be, presuming that the majority of these things, and again, in the general conversation when we're talking about UFOs, that term can apply to a lot of different things, including some natural phenomena. I think we expressly mean that which appears to be a variety of technology of undetermined origin. I think it's fair to say that that's exclusively what we mean in this kind of a conversation. Not to say that government would be exclusively interested in that, but that would be predominantly, I would think, what they would study because of the defense implications. They may feel that, the study of natural, earth lights, plasmas, things like that might have weapon systems applications too, for all we know. But again, that's not a technology. So, it's interesting to me that and Paul Dean has pointed out, back during the Vietnam era, we had the so-called Have Fear and the Lethal Chaser operations. And I think rather than programs like Project Blue Book that had a kind of architecture and a fairly defined purview, AATIP, Have Fear, Lethal Chaser, other organization, or again, operations or contracts, call them what you will, they may have been more loosely defined over the years. And like you said, and as Paul Dean has argued, that might have been in part to help keep them off the books and keep them less easily traceable. Esoteric names like Have Fear and things like that. I mean, again, if those are protected due to being sensitive information, and civilians are unlikely to find out about that, and even if they do hear about it, they aren't probably going to be able to glean from the name alone what it is, it's far less likely that it will be asked about later on down the road from a freedom of information perspective, that people know what to ask about and therefore ask for details.
Yeah, I did want to add that, and the important thing to a lot of these people may be those products, just like we have in AATIP, these AATIP documents that we're talking about, where it has a list of products which are papers. And those papers could be the most important things is as opposed to where they originated from. So people could still be working with those papers. And then, it says it's part of this program, the advanced physics, group or whatever. Whereas they're not as concerned about that. They're concerned about the content of the paper. So I guess what I'm getting at is it doesn't necessarily mean to be this major kind of hiding aliens in spaceships type of thing. The other motivation they would have for using these different names for these groups of people getting together to look at this stuff would be just like Harry Reid talked about. We kept it classified, and we had these, kind of names that were more mundane, or at least wouldn't raise any interest, because we didn't want the public to ridicule that we're taking UFOs seriously. And that's been a major concern, I think.
Absolutely. It's fascinating. We are, I think, finally seeing at least some of the pieces of this narrative fall together. Before I turn you loose, we've got to talk a little about Project Blue Book. So you've seen the new series, obviously. I'd like to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, and it could be just because I get to interview, people in the, script writers and directors and things like that occasionally. And I work with on other shows that are science-based and so or historical fiction. And I am definitely more forgiving of the branches from reality. Historical fiction is just that, historical fiction. I've always been a fan of historical fiction, but you always have a range of how much accuracy there is in a program, but none of them are completely accurate. You can't really do that. Historical fiction is attempting to dramatize and entertain while giving you some background into what happened during the time. But as a writer, someone putting it together, it's especially something like this, which is so short and you're covering so much. You can't introduce every person. You can't introduce, all of the details. So what you have to do is try to grab the essence of it to get across to people. And I think that at least in some very important ways, the show has done that. So for instance, the Air Force, of course, being dismissive and trying to write off these cases. That's accurate. That's like what we were talking about. It seemed like more of a PR thing to kind of get people to say, hey, there's nothing to this UFO thing. So that's accurate. And then you have this scientist who's, skeptical, but willing to have an open mind and look into things in the Hynek character, who's very likable. And I think Aidan Gillen does a great job with it. So I think that they've got that. And then they're representing these real cases. I think that, I don't know. I try to stay away from looking at what a lot of the UFO or quote unquote core group or group of quote unquote ufologists are doing, because they're often territorial and extremely negative.
Yep.
And it's a waste of time. I don't want to just, complain about everything. I want to look and research and share information. And this show is doing that, sharing information. You're seeing a lot of news pop over all over the country about sightings in our state, here's Project Blue Book. Here was a Project Blue Book in our city or in our state. It's really getting people interested in what Project Blue Book was really like. And even better, not from a debunker's standpoint, but from Hynek's standpoint, a scientist who is truly looking for answers, who discovered there's something more to this UFO thing than the Air Force wants the public to know, and that most scientists are paying attention to. That's very positive. And on top of that, History Channel has released these great articles about all these cases that are in the show, further bringing awareness of the facts to these cases. So I see it as a net gain big time. And, I've interviewed Paul Hynek's son. I know Martin Willis, my colleague, has interviewed Joel and Paul, both of the kids recently. They're ecstatic. They think it's great. They got to consult. They understood and struggled with, the fact versus fiction. But they feel that their father, at least his nature and spirit, is being represented positively and in a proper manner. And they're happy with it. So I don't know. Overall, I'm certainly very happy. Do I wish they could stick to the facts and dramatize a little less? I always feel like that with television. But then again, you've got to get viewership. You got to get eyes on your show. So it's a careful balance. And I think it's a successful balance that they've reached so far, especially given the number of eyeballs. They've gotten tons of viewership of the show. It's doing very well.
They absolutely have done very well with it. And again, I think you and I are kind of outliers in that sense, because you pretty much summarized everything that I feel. I don't have to just have people on my show that I just agree with, but I happen to agree with you on pretty much everything when it comes to our interest in UFOs, because, again, I try to be optimistic. And I think that, as you point out, and again, I'm pretty apt, maybe because I am self-ascribed as one of the more skeptical people within the UFO community. I'm often asked, well, Micah, do you go to as many skeptic events as you do UFO events if you're such a skeptic? And I have to point out, it's like, well, what's interesting is there are a lot of skeptics like me in the ufological community, and the ufological community that is less skeptical is still willing to entertain my skepticism, and I get invited to those events to speak and be skeptical. The skeptic events don't invite me to come and speak because they will not allow, generally, for any discussion that at least appears to be in advocacy of this subject. And so it's interesting because, like you pointed out, there are a lot of people who I think kind of like to just be embroiled in flame wars and fighting. And I don't think it's just social media. Right. I think social media has only made an existing problem worse. And while that is existent in the UFO community, you also see that on the other side too, and that sometimes the two sides, skepticism and the advocates, go at it. Actually, they do it all the time. And so with the release of this program, reception has been mixed, to say the least. But I'm like you, I'm hopeful in the sense that, look, guys, we know this is only based, and loosely at that, on the history. But it's a well-produced show. It brings to the public attention, at very least, the concept that it is rooted in, and therefore there is a broader public knowledge of the actual historical Project Blue Book and the work of J. Allen Hynek, a guy who has been continually maligned over the years. Oh, this guy wasn't really scientific. Look, I've read not everything he's ever written, but I would say a very large majority of everything that is available in print that Hynek has contributed to scientific inquiry in relation to the UFO subject over the years. And I got to tell you, everything I can determine based on my reading of Hynek shows that this guy was the consummate scientist. Mark O'Connell, who wrote his biography, said the same thing. And sadly, the fact that he was interested and associated with UFOs drew a lot of attention away from his other scientific contributions as an astronomer. And so in his book, and I loved this, he talked about the fact that, hey, Hynek wasn't just a UFO researcher. He was an astronomer. That's what got him on the game, so to speak, in the first place. And he made other scientific contributions. This idea that Hynek hadn't been a scientist because he had been in the advocate camp as it relates to UFOs, that's nonsense to me. What are your thoughts?
I totally agree. Of course, he was a scientist. That's why he was hired on by the Air Force. If he wasn't a well-respected scientist, they wouldn't have put him in that position and kept him there. That was his role as, and for a project that was PR in nature, they had to make sure that, everything appeared on the up and up. And so they had to have a respectable scientist that people recognize as a respectable scientist. And they did in Hynek. But, that's another thing I think we agree on is you talk a lot about Hynek's history and everything, obviously having, an affinity for him. And so do I. I've always tried to insert him into all the talks I do, because one of the worst things that I've always felt could happen is that we could forget Hynek. And I don't want people to forget him. So I always find a reason to insert him into my lectures. And that's one of the other reasons that I'm so excited about this program is that it's really highlighting and Hynek and his work. And it's making him kind of bringing who he was to a new generation of people and appreciating and celebrating that. And that's another reason that maybe it makes me biased towards it, that I absolutely love that this show is happening.
Yeah. Oh, but it's a good show, too. I mean, it is well produced. Before I let you go, one more thing. You mentioned talking with one of Hynek's sons. Our good friend Martin Willis had one of them on the program recently, his show, Podcast UFO. Are Hynek's sons as involved with UFO research, or are they as interested as their father had been?
Not as interested. They have, I think, varying degrees of interest. But Paul, who I talked to, is also a futurist. I think Paul's the youngest. Mm-hmm. Very successful, person. And he is actually, I think, really getting his interest peaked lately. I think that, especially with the show, everybody's looking for kind of a representative from the Hynek camp, and I think he's more than welcome, more than happy to step up. And I have not heard him turn down anyone when it comes to a podcast or anything. So he's really liking to get out there and to talk about all of this. And at least in his futurism kind of background, he's also worked in television. He's got kind of an idea of how, which I think is important, and I think you would too, how UFOs and the topic kind of fits into the culture and fits into where we're going as a culture. And so, yeah, he really likes it. He's really into it. And I think it's more of, from here going forward, he'll be more involved as opposed to, either of them being involved in the past, although they're very, very proud of their father.
Yeah, I think if he were my father, I would be proud of him too. I mean, J. Allen Hynek, right. He's truly, in my opinion, a paragon in terms of those who have tried to look at science as it relates to this subject, and who initially, a skeptic himself, over time seemed to be more compelled by the evidence. He's been attacked by modern skeptics over that, but again, I think that they forget how skeptical he really was. I've even seen arguments made that, well, he was never really a skeptic if he would completely change his mind like that. But when we have people...
Yeah, that is such a frustrating argument, because that's ridiculous. Scientists change their mind based off of data all the time, and they do complete 180s all of the time, and they're not happy when they debunk their own theories, but they will. That's what a scientist does. And if they debunk their own theory and something else completely counter to what they thought turns out to be the case, then they run with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's, I think, how science proceeds. We have to be willing, if there is new evidence forthcoming and it refutes an old idea or hypothesis, we have to be willing to look at that new evidence. When we get to a point where scientists will not entertain new data, we're no longer skeptical. We're denialists. There's a big difference right there. Hynek was not a denialist. He was a skeptic, I think, even to the very end, and he never quite figured out what this phenomenon was. He probably went to his grave still wondering. He maybe had some ideas, but I don't think he ever quite figured it out. We're all continuing in that tradition. So I'm with you. I think that the show, taking it for what it is, come on, it's drama, it's fun, but that just should encourage more people to go and actually read the literature and learn about it. And of course, they can learn a lot about this at openminds.tv. You write for Open Minds. You have for many years. You also write for Den of Geek. Alejandro, where can people find more of your work online?
Yeah, Open Minds TV. Of course, you can find a lot of it, and on Den of Geek, because I've been writing a lot, especially with Project Blue Book and this Roswell, New Mexico show that's going on. In fact, I was part of a special on Roswell for the CW recently. So yeah, I would say Open Minds TV, Den of Geek. In fact, I'm writing a lot about these topics we just talked about at Den of Geek currently, especially in relation to those shows. And then if you want to kind of see an overview of everything on Patreon, you can look for me there, and I post links to all of these things that I'm working on.
Alejandro Rojas of Open Minds will be sure and get you back on again soon for further updates about this very intriguing subject in the ongoing saga of the Pentagon's UFO program.